A baby beaver was swept away by floodwaters, torn from his family, tumbling helplessly through a raging river with no escape. But a moose jumped in after him. A massive creature from a completely different world heard the chaos and made an impossible choice. He plunged into those deadly waters to save a life he had no obligation to save. This is the story of how two creatures from opposite ends of the animal kingdom formed an unlikely bond that defied every law of nature and revealed something profound about compassion that transcends species. The morning sun filtered through the dense forest canopy, casting dappled shadows across the river's surface. It was a perfect day in the beaver colony, the kind of day that felt eternal, like nothing could ever change. The baby beaver, only a few months old, paddled lazily through the water alongside his mother, his small body still learning the rhythms of river life. His fur was sleek and dark, his tail flat and powerful even at his young age. He didn't know yet that this tail would become his greatest asset, his rudder through life's most treacherous waters. The colony thrived in this bend of the river. 3 generations lived here. His grandmother, his parents, his aunts and uncles, and his siblings. They had built their lodge with meticulous precision, a fortress of mud and branches that had withstood countless seasons. The dam they maintained stretched across the narrowest part of the river, a masterpiece of engineering that created a perfect reservoir for the family. This was safety. This was home. This was everything the baby beaver had ever known. His father was the colony's leader, a massive beaver with scars on his back from old territorial battles. He moved through the water with absolute authority, inspecting the dam's integrity, checking the food cache they'd been building since autumn. The baby beaver watched his father with admiration that bordered on worship. Someday, he thought, he would be that strong, that capable, that certain of his place in the world. But today, he was still young, still learning, still safe. His mother nudged him gently toward a patch of tender bark they'd stripped from a willow tree. "Eat," she seemed to say without words. The baby beaver understood the language of survival instinctively. Food now meant strength later. He gnawed at the bark, the familiar taste grounding him in the comfort of routine. His siblings played nearby, chasing each other in circles, their movements quick and joyful. This was innocence. This was the life he was supposed to live. The afternoon brought a subtle shift. The older beavers noticed it first, a change in the air, a tension in the way the wind moved through the trees. The baby beaver's grandmother, ancient and wise from decades of river life, paused mid-swim. Her whiskers twitched. She had survived droughts and freezes, predators and territorial invasions. She had learned to read the river like a language. And right now, the river was speaking in a dialect she recognized with dread. The sky, which had been clear that morning, began to darken. Not the gentle dimming of approaching evening, but something more ominous. A bruised, swollen darkness that pressed down from above like a hand closing into a fist. The temperature dropped. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze, began to gust with increasing violence, bending the treetops and sending leaves spiraling into the water. The baby beaver's father emerged from the lodge, his massive frame suddenly tense. He called out, a series of sharp, urgent sounds that cut through the afternoon air. The other beavers responded immediately, their playful movements transforming into purposeful action. The baby beaver felt it then, the first real fear of his young life. Something was wrong. Something fundamental had shifted in the world he thought he understood. His mother gathered her children close, her protective instincts overriding everything else. "Stay near," her movements commanded. The baby beaver obeyed, pressing against his mother's side, his small heart beginning to race. He had never felt her fear before. In his short life, his mother had been a constant source of safety, an immovable force of protection. But now, even she seemed uncertain. The wind intensified. The water began to move differently. Not the gentle current the baby beaver knew, but something restless and angry. Small waves formed on the surface, something that almost never happened in this protected bend of river. The dam, that magnificent structure that had always seemed permanent, began to strain. The beavers could hear it. The creak of wood under pressure, the groan of mud and branches pushed beyond their design limits. The baby beaver's father moved with desperate urgency now, swimming toward the dam to assess the damage. His grandmother followed, her ancient body moving with surprising speed. The other adults formed a protective circle around the young ones, but there was no hiding the fear in their eyes. The baby beaver understood, even in his youth, that something catastrophic was approaching. The sky opened. Rain began to fall. Not the gentle rain of spring or the steady rain of autumn, but a deluge. It came down in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to mere feet. The river, responding to the assault from above and the runoff from the surrounding mountains, began to rise. Slowly at first, then with accelerating speed. The water level climbed inch by inch, then foot by foot. The dam began to fail. The baby beaver heard his father's desperate calls, urgent sounds that meant nothing to him, but everything to the colony. The adults moved with frantic energy, trying to reinforce the dam, trying to redirect the water, trying to do anything to stop the inevitable. But nature had other plans. The pressure was too great. The water was too angry. The dam, which had taken weeks to build and months to perfect, began to crumble. The colony's perfect world was collapsing. The baby beaver's mother pulled her children toward the lodge, toward what she hoped would be safety. But even as she moved, the baby beaver could sense that she didn't know if safety existed anymore. The lodge had always been their fortress. But what good was a fortress when the entire river was rising against them? The water climbed higher. The baby beaver had never seen it at this level. It was approaching the entrance to the lodge, something that had never happened in his lifetime. His siblings pressed close, their small bodies trembling. The older beavers were shouting now, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of alarm and desperation. Then came the sound, a terrible, earth-shaking sound, like the world itself was tearing apart. A massive section of the dam gave way completely. The pressure that had been building exploded outward in a catastrophic release of force. The water didn't just rise anymore, it raged. It became a weapon, a living thing with intention and hunger. The baby beaver's father made a decision in that moment. He gathered as many of his family as he could and began moving them deeper into the lodge, into the upper chambers where they might survive the rising water. But there wasn't room for everyone. There wasn't time for everyone. The current intensified. What had been a manageable river was now a raging torrent. The water moved with terrifying speed, carrying debris, branches, rocks, entire trees torn from the banks. The baby beaver clung to his mother, but he could feel her grip weakening as the current pulled at them both. And then it happened. A massive surge of water, a wall of force that seemed to come from nowhere, slammed into the lodge. The baby beaver was torn away from his mother's side in an instant. He felt the current grab him, felt himself being pulled away from everything he knew, away from safety, away from family. He tried to swim against it, tried to reach back toward his mother. but the current was too strong. It was like being caught in the grip of a giant, invisible hand. The baby beaver tumbled through the water, disoriented and terrified. He could see nothing but brown, churning water. He couldn't tell which direction was up. He couldn't find his mother. He couldn't find anything familiar. He was alone. He was being swept away. And the worst part, the part that would haunt him if he survived, was that he could hear his mother's desperate cries echoing through the water, growing fainter and fainter as the current pulled him deeper into the raging river. But the baby beaver had no idea what was about to happen in the next few hours. He had no idea that his separation from his family was only the beginning of a nightmare that would test every instinct he possessed. And he had absolutely no idea that help was coming, help from the most unexpected place imaginable. The floodwaters didn't come gradually. They came like a verdict, sudden, absolute, and final. What had been a manageable crisis in the moments before now became a catastrophe that swallowed everything whole. The rain continued to fall in sheets so dense that the world beyond a few feet disappeared entirely. The river, responding to the deluge from above, and the torrential runoff from the mountains, transformed from a familiar home into something unrecognizable. The water level rose with terrifying speed, 6 inches, then a foot, then 2 feet in the span of minutes. The current accelerated, moving faster than any of the beavers had ever experienced, faster than their instincts told them was possible. The baby beaver's father stood at the entrance to the lodge, his massive frame silhouetted against the chaos outside. He could see the destruction unfolding in real time. The dam, that magnificent structure that represented generations of beaver engineering, was breaking apart like it was made of paper. Sections that should have held for decades crumbled under the relentless pressure. The water that the dam had been designed to contain was now pouring through the breaches with apocalyptic force. He made a choice that would define the next hours. He gathered the youngest beavers and pushed them deeper into the lodge, toward the upper chambers. His mate, the baby beaver's mother, herded the children forward, her maternal instincts overriding the terror that threatened to paralyze her. But even as she moved them toward safety, she knew the truth that her mate had already accepted. There might not be enough room. There might not be time. Some of them might not survive. The water outside continued to rise. It reached the main entrance of the lodge. Then it began seeping through the walls, not through cracks or failures in construction, but through the sheer volume of pressure from a river that had become something other than water. It was a force. It was an invasion. It was the end of the world as the colony knew it. The baby beaver's grandmother, ancient and wise, moved with surprising speed despite her age. She had lived through difficult times before, but never anything like this. She understood with the clarity that comes from decades of experience that this flood was different. This wasn't a seasonal rise that would recede in a few days. This was something catastrophic, something that might reshape the entire landscape. The other adults worked frantically to reinforce the lodge from the inside, packing mud into gaps, trying to slow the water's advance. But it was like trying to hold back the ocean with your bare hands. The pressure was relentless. The water found every weakness, every tiny imperfection in their construction. Outside, the world was transforming into something unrecognizable. Trees that had stood for decades were being uprooted, their massive trunks snapped like twigs by the force of the current. Rocks the size of boulders tumbled downstream, creating a deadly landscape of debris. Entire sections of riverbank were collapsing, the soil giving way to the water's hunger. Animals from the surrounding forest, deer, raccoons, smaller creatures, were fleeing in panic, seeking higher ground, seeking anywhere that wasn't the river. The baby beaver's father made another decision. They couldn't stay in the lodge. The water was rising too fast. If it continued at this rate, it would fill the entire structure within minutes. They had to move. They had to get to higher ground. They had to abandon the home that had taken generations to build. He called out, sharp, urgent sounds that cut through the roar of the flood. His family responded, moving toward the emergency exit, a tunnel that led upward toward the highest point of their territory. It was a route they had never needed to use, a backup plan that had always seemed theoretical, something that would never actually be necessary. Until now. The mother beaver gathered her children, the baby beaver, his siblings, and the younger members of the extended family. She moved them toward the tunnel, her body shielding them from the worst of the rushing water. The current was already significant inside the lodge, pulling at their bodies, trying to sweep them away even in this enclosed space. The baby beaver swam as hard as his young muscles could manage, following his mother's lead. The tunnel was narrow, designed for efficient movement, not for evacuation. The water was already flowing through it, creating a current that pushed against them, making every forward movement a battle. Behind them, the baby beaver could hear his father organizing the older members of the family, making sure everyone was accounted for, making sure no one was left behind. His voice was steady, even in the chaos. The voice of a leader trying to hold his world together, even as it fell apart. They emerged from the tunnel into a landscape transformed by chaos. The area that had been dry ground just minutes before was now a raging secondary current. The water from the flooded river was spreading outward, seeking new channels, new paths downhill. Trees that had seemed solid were now surrounded by water. The higher ground they had been seeking was shrinking by the second as the floodwaters continued to rise. The baby beaver's mother pushed her children toward the highest point she could see, a rocky outcropping about 30 feet away. It wasn't much, but it was higher than everything else in the immediate area. They had to reach it. They had to get above the rising water. But the distance between them and safety was becoming a gauntlet. The floodwaters were moving in multiple directions now, creating whirlpools and dangerous currents. The baby beaver's mother had to navigate through this chaos while keeping her children together. One moment of inattention, one slip, and one of them could be swept away. The baby beaver swam with everything he had, his young body pushed to its limits. The water was cold, far colder than the comfortable river he knew. It was violent. It was chaotic. It was nothing like anything he had experienced in his short life. His siblings were struggling too. The younger ones were crying out, their sounds high-pitched and desperate. The older siblings were trying to help, trying to guide the younger ones. But the current made it almost impossible to maintain any kind of formation. They were halfway to the outcropping when the baby beaver's father appeared beside them, his massive body a shield against the worst of the current. He was helping, pushing, directing them towards safety. But the baby beaver could see the exhaustion in his movements, the strain of fighting against forces that were beyond any creature's ability to fully resist. The water continued to rise. It was up to their necks now. The baby beaver had to stretch to keep his head above the surface. His siblings were in even more difficulty. The smallest ones were barely able to keep their noses above the waterline. The mother beaver was holding them up, her maternal strength pushing them forward even as her own energy was being depleted by the relentless current. They reached the outcropping. It was smaller than it had appeared from a distance, barely large enough for all of them to stand on. But it was higher than the water, and that was all that mattered. The family clustered together on the rocks, their bodies pressed close for warmth and comfort. The baby beaver could feel his mother's heartbeat racing, could feel the trembling in her muscles. But they had made it. They were alive. They were together. Except the baby beaver's father was counting, his eyes moving from one family member to the next, accounting for each one. His expression changed. His body went rigid. The baby beaver understood, even in his youth, what that expression meant. Someone was missing. The baby beaver looked around frantically. His siblings were here. His mother was here. His grandmother was here, along with several aunts and uncles. But his youngest sister, the one who had been struggling the most, the one who was smallest, was not here. His father made a decision in that moment. Despite the exhaustion, despite the danger, despite the fact that the water was still rising and the current was still raging, he dove back into the flood. The baby beaver watched his father disappear into the brown, churning water. He wanted to cry out, wanted to follow, but his mother held him firmly in place. No, her grip seemed to say, "You cannot help. You can only survive." Minutes passed, long, agonizing minutes where the baby beaver's father didn't return. The water continued to rise. The rocks they were standing on were becoming smaller as the floodwaters climbed higher. Then his father emerged, gasping, struggling, his massive body fighting the current with everything he had. And in his mouth, held carefully above the water, was the baby beaver's youngest sister. She was alive, but barely conscious, her small body limp and unresponsive. The father, Beaver, hauled himself onto the rocks and collapsed, his breathing ragged and desperate. The mother immediately began attending to the youngest sister, using her body heat to warm her, stimulating her to breathe, to respond. They had all survived the initial flood. But the water was still rising, and the rocks were still shrinking. The baby beaver's father looked out at the landscape, at the destruction, at the water that seemed to be claiming everything. His expression was grim. The rocks they were on would not be safe for long. The water was rising too quickly, too relentlessly. They would need to move again, would need to find higher ground, would need to keep climbing until they reached somewhere the flood could not follow. But as he looked around, the baby beaver's father realized something that filled him with dread. There might not be anywhere high enough. The flood was spreading across the entire landscape. It was covering everything. It was relentless and absolute. The family huddled together on the rocks as the water continued to rise, as the storm raged overhead, as the world they had known disappeared beneath the flood. And in that chaos, in that moment of desperate survival, no one noticed that the baby beaver had drifted slightly away from the group. No one saw him slip from the rocks into the water. No one heard his small cry for help before the current pulled him away. One moment he was there. The next he was gone, swept away into the raging river, separated from his family, alone in the darkness and the chaos. The baby beaver tumbled through the water, disoriented and terrified. He tried to swim, tried to find the surface, tried to find anything familiar. But the current was too strong. The water was too violent. He was being pulled deeper, pulled faster, pulled toward a fate that seemed unavoidable. But he had no idea that his separation from his family was not the end of his story. He had no idea that somewhere in the forest, another creature had heard the roar of the flood. Another creature was about to make a choice that would change everything. 3 miles upstream, in a clearing where the forest opened to a meadow, a massive moose stood at the edge of the rising water. His name, if moose had names in the human sense, was something that translated roughly to "he who walks through winter," a name earned through decades of surviving the harshest seasons the northern wilderness had to offer. He was enormous, nearly 10 feet tall at the shoulder, with a massive rack of antlers that spread 6 feet across. His body was muscular and powerful, built for traversing deep snow and fighting rivals during the rut. He weighed over 1,000 pounds, a creature that seemed almost prehistoric in his size and presence. To most animals in the forest, he was a force of nature, something to be respected and feared. But even a moose could not ignore what was happening to the river. He had come to this clearing to feed, as he did most. Afternoons. The willow and aspen trees that grew along the water's edge provided excellent browse, and he had been methodically stripping bark and leaves from the lower branches when the sky began to darken. He had noticed the change in the air, the temperature drop, the way the wind shifted. He had lived long enough to recognize the signs of a major storm approaching. But he had not anticipated this. The river, which normally flowed at a moderate pace, had begun to swell within minutes. The moose had watched it happen with the calm detachment of a creature who had survived many seasons. Floods came and went. They were part of the natural cycle. The moose would simply move to higher ground and wait for the water to recede. Except this flood was different. The water level rose faster than he had ever seen it rise. It climbed the banks with relentless speed, spreading outward into the meadow where he stood. Within minutes, the shallow water around his legs had become knee-deep. Within more minutes, it was approaching his belly. The current was strong, stronger than anything he had experienced in his long life. The moose began to move toward higher ground, his massive legs pushing through the water with the determination of a creature accustomed to traversing difficult terrain. But even as he moved, he could see that the flood was spreading faster than he could walk away from it. The water was everywhere, claiming the meadow, climbing toward the tree line. He reached the edge of the forest and continued upward, following the natural slope of the land. Behind him, the water continued to rise, turning the meadow into a lake, swallowing the trees he had been feeding on just minutes before. The moose paused on slightly higher ground and turned back to look at what had been his feeding area. The transformation was shocking. The familiar landscape had become something alien, something dominated by water and chaos. Debris floated on the surface, branches, entire trees, rocks that had been dislodged from the riverbed. The roar of the water was constant, a deep and primal sound that seemed to come from the earth itself. He stood there for a moment, his massive head turned toward the flood, his ears alert to every sound. There was something in his ancient brain, something that had been encoded into moose DNA over thousands of years, that made him pause. Some instinct that told him this moment mattered. This moment was significant in a way he couldn't quite articulate. The moose was not a creature given to introspection or deep emotion. He was pragmatic, driven by instinct and survival. He did not think about abstract concepts. He did not ponder the meaning of existence. He simply lived, moment by moment, responding to the demands of his environment. But in this moment, something shifted. Perhaps it was the sound, a thin, high-pitched cry that cut through the roar of the flood. It was the sound of something small, something young, something in desperate distress. The moose's ears swiveled toward the sound, tracking it through the chaos. There, in the water, tumbling through the current, was a small creature. The moose's eyes, adapted for seeing movement, tracked it with precision. It was a beaver, a young one, barely more than a kid. It was being swept downstream by the current, its small body no match for the power of the flood. The moose watched it for a moment, his massive brain processing what he was seeing. A beaver. Young. In danger. None of this was his concern. The moose had no relationship with beavers. They occupied different ecological niches. They had no reason to interact. The survival of one young beaver had no bearing on the moose's own existence. He should have turned away. He should have continued moving to higher ground, ensuring his own safety. That was what any rational creature would do. That was what survival demanded. But the moose did not turn away. Instead, he watched as the young beaver was swept closer to where he stood. The water was deep here, perhaps 8 feet, and the current was moving at a terrifying speed. The beaver's small head kept disappearing beneath the surface, only to pop back up a moment later, gasping for breath. The creature was struggling, fighting against the current with everything it had, but it was a losing battle. The flood was too strong. The beaver was being carried downstream toward a section of river where massive boulders jutted from the banks, a place where the current was even more violent, even more dangerous. The baby beaver would not survive if he reached those boulders. The moose took a step toward the water. It was not a conscious decision, not exactly. It was more like an impulse, something that came from a part of his brain that operated on a level deeper than rational thought. Some ancient instinct that recognized suffering and responded to it. Some part of him that understood, in a way he could not articulate, that this moment mattered. He took another step. The water was cold, shockingly cold. It swirled around his legs, pulling at him with surprising force. The moose was strong, but even his strength had limits. The current was trying to sweep him off his feet, trying to carry him downstream along with the debris and the young beaver. But the moose was heavier, more grounded, more able to resist the current than the small creature being swept away. He took another step, moving deeper into the water. His massive body provided a barrier against the flood, a point of resistance that the water had to flow around. The young beaver was getting closer. The moose could see the panic in the creature's eyes, could see the desperate thrashing as it fought against the current. The beaver had no idea that help was coming. It had no concept that another creature was about to risk its own safety for its sake. The moose took another step. The water was up to his ribs now, and the current was pulling at him with increasing force. He could feel the power of the flood, could feel how easily it could sweep him away if he lost his footing. One slip, one moment of weakness, and he would be tumbled downstream, just like the beaver. But he did not slip. The young beaver was almost to him now. The moose could see the small creature's mouth open in a soundless cry, could see the exhaustion in its movements. The beaver was fading, losing the battle against the current, losing consciousness even as it fought to survive. The moose reached out, not with his hooves, which would have been useless and potentially harmful, but with his massive body. He positioned himself to intercept the beaver's trajectory, to catch the small creature before it was swept past him toward the deadly boulders downstream. The beaver collided with the moose's body. It was a gentle collision, as gentle as anything could be in the midst of a raging flood. The moose felt the small creature make contact with his side, felt it grab onto his fur with desperate claws. The beaver's grip was weak. The creature was barely conscious, barely aware of what was happening. But it was there. The moose had caught him. But catching the beaver was only the first part of the challenge. The current was still pulling at both of them, trying to sweep them downstream. The moose's legs were straining against the pressure, his massive muscles burning with effort. He could feel himself being pulled, could feel the flood trying to claim him along with the beaver he now held. He had to get to safety. He had to get out of the water before the current became too strong, before his legs gave out, before the flood claimed both of them. The moose began to move backward, toward the bank, toward higher ground. Each step was a battle. The current pulled at him, fought him, tried to drag him deeper. But the moose was determination incarnate. He was survival. He was the will to live expressed in 1,000 pounds of muscle and bone. Step by step, he pushed backward. The young beaver clung to his fur, barely conscious, its small body pressed against the moose's massive side. The creature had no idea that it was being saved. It only knew that the current had stopped pulling it away, that something solid was holding it, that there was a possibility, however slim, that it might survive. The water was getting shallower. The moose's hooves were finding purchase on the riverbed again, his legs pushing with renewed strength as the depth decreased. The current was still strong, but it was manageable now. The moose could feel the difference. He could feel the possibility of success. Another step, another step, another step. His front hooves touched the bank. He hauled himself upward, his massive body moving with surprising grace for a creature so large. The young beaver was still clinging to his fur, still barely conscious, still fighting to stay alive. The moose pulled himself completely onto the bank and collapsed, his breathing heavy and labored. He had expended enormous energy fighting the current, and his massive body was trembling with exhaustion. His muscles burned. His legs felt weak. But he was alive. And the young beaver, still clinging to his fur, was alive. The moose lay there for a moment, catching his breath, processing what he had just done. He had entered the flood. He had risked his own life. He had saved a creature he had no connection to, no reason to care about. Why had he done that? The moose did not have an answer. He only knew that when he had seen the young beaver in danger, something inside him had responded, something ancient and primal and fundamentally good. The young beaver's eyes fluttered open. The creature was coughing, expelling water from its lungs, gasping for air. It was alive. Barely, but alive. The moose watched the small creature, watched it struggle back to consciousness, watched it realize that it had been saved by something impossible, by a creature from a completely different world, by an animal that had no reason to care whether it lived or died. And in that moment, something changed in both of them. The baby beaver looked up at the massive moose, its small eyes wide with confusion and wonder. The moose looked down at the tiny creature, and for the first time in his long life, he understood what it meant to care about something beyond himself. A bond had formed, not through choice, not through reason, but through an act of pure compassion. A moose had saved a beaver, and in doing so, he had changed both of their lives forever. The baby beaver was alive. But he was also far from home, far from his family, far from everything he knew. He had no idea where he was or how he had survived. He only knew that the massive creature who had saved him was now his entire world, his shelter, his protector, his only hope of survival in a landscape transformed by catastrophe. And the moose, for the first time in his long life, had found a purpose beyond mere survival. He had found something worth protecting. He had found a reason to care. The rain continued to fall, relentless and cold. The moose lay on the muddy bank, his massive body providing shelter for the small beaver that clung to his fur. The young beaver's breathing was shallow and irregular, his body still trembling from the shock of nearly drowning. But he was alive. Against all odds, against every law of nature that suggested a tiny creature could not survive what he had just endured, the baby beaver was alive. The moose remained motionless, allowing the young creature to rest against his side. His massive head was turned toward the floodwaters, watching the chaos unfold with the patience of a creature who had learned long ago that some things could not be rushed or controlled. The water continued to rise, spreading across the landscape like a living thing, claiming everything in its path. But here, on this slightly elevated bank, they were safe. For now. The baby beaver's eyes were barely open, his consciousness flickering in and out like a candle flame in the wind. He did not understand what had happened. His mind was a confusion of terror and cold, and the overwhelming sensation of being pulled away from everything he knew. He did not understand that the massive creature he was clinging to had saved his life. He only knew that this creature was warm, that it was solid, that it was the only thing between him and the chaos of the flood. The moose's breathing was deep and steady, a rhythm that gradually began to calm the baby beaver's racing heart. The young creature's breathing started to synchronize with the moose's, matching the pattern of inhale and exhale. It was an unconscious process, but it was effective. The baby beaver's trembling began to subside. His grip on the moose's fur loosened slightly as exhaustion began to overtake terror. Hours passed. The storm raged on, showing no signs of abating. The rain fell in sheets so dense that visibility was reduced to mere feet. The wind howled through the trees, bending them nearly double, threatening to snap branches and uproot entire trunks. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the landscape in brief moments of stark clarity, revealing the extent of the devastation below. The moose did not move. He remained in place, his massive body a fortress against the elements, his presence a constant reassurance to the small creature that depended on him. The moose's thick fur shed water, protecting him from the worst of the rain. His body heat radiated outward, warming the young beaver who would have died from hypothermia within minutes if left alone in these conditions. The baby beaver slipped into an uneasy sleep, his small body curled against the moose's warmth. In his dreams, he was back with his family, back in the lodge, back in the world as it had been before the flood. He was swimming with his siblings, playing in the familiar current, listening to his mother's gentle guidance. It was a dream of safety, of comfort, of everything that had been taken from him. But even in sleep, the baby beaver's grip on the moose's fur did not loosen. Some part of his consciousness understood that this creature was his lifeline, that letting go meant death. The moose watched over him through the night, his massive eyes occasionally closing for brief moments of rest, but never fully sleeping. Some part of him remained alert, remained vigilant, remained ready to respond to any threat. It was an instinct that had kept him alive through countless seasons, and it did not abandon him now. As the hours passed, the moose became aware of something he had not considered before. The baby beaver was dependent on him, not just for this moment, but potentially for much longer. The young creature was far from home, far from its family, far from the resources it would need to survive. The moose understood, in the way that animals understand such things, that the baby beaver could not survive alone in this landscape. And somehow, inexplicably, the moose found that he did not want the young creature to be alone. The night dragged on. The storm showed no signs of weakening. If anything, it was intensifying. The wind was stronger, the rain was heavier, the water level was still rising. The moose had lived through many storms, but this was something different. This was a catastrophe, a moment when nature revealed its true power and indifference to the survival of individual creatures. But the moose and the baby beaver endured. As dawn approached, the rain began to ease slightly. Not stopping, The storm was far from over, but lessening enough that the world became slightly more visible. The moose could see the extent of the damage now. Trees that had stood for decades were snapped or uprooted. The entire landscape had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The meadow where he had been feeding was now a lake, its surface churning with debris and dangerous currents. The baby beaver stirred, his small body shifting against the moose's side. His eyes opened, and for a moment, confusion dominated his expression. He did not know where he was. He did not know how he had come to be here. He only knew that he was alive, that he was warm, and that the massive creature beneath him was somehow connected to his survival. The moose lowered his massive head, bringing his face closer to the baby beaver. For a moment, the two creatures simply looked at each other. A 1,000-pound moose and a small beaver, separated by every evolutionary difference that nature could create, yet connected by something that transcended species and logic. The baby beaver made a sound, a small, tentative chirp that was barely audible over the sound of the rain. It was a sound of confusion, of fear, of a desperate attempt to understand what had happened and where his family had gone. The moose did not respond with words. Moose did not have the capacity for human speech, but he responded with presence. He remained still, allowing the young beaver to explore, to understand that this massive creature meant no harm. The moose's eyes were gentle, his movements deliberate and slow, designed not to frighten the small creature that depended on him. The baby beaver crawled slightly, moving across the moose's massive shoulder, his small claws finding purchase in the thick fur. He was weak, exhausted, still in shock from everything he had experienced. But he was moving. He was alive. He was exploring his new reality. The moose stood slowly, his massive body unfolding with surprising grace for a creature so large. The movement was careful, designed not to dislodge the young beaver. The moose looked around at the transformed landscape, assessing the situation with the practical wisdom of a creature who had survived many seasons. The water was still rising, but more slowly now. The worst of the flood seemed to be passing. The moose knew from experience that the water would eventually recede, that the landscape would slowly return to something resembling normalcy. But that would take time. Days, perhaps weeks. During that time, both he and the young beaver would need shelter, food, and safety. The moose began to move, carefully making his way along the bank toward higher ground. The baby beaver clung to his fur, understanding instinctively that the moose was moving them to safety. The young creature did not question this. It did not wonder why a massive moose would care about the survival of a tiny beaver. It only knew that this creature had saved it, and that following this creature was the path to survival. They moved through the transformed landscape, navigating around fallen trees and dangerous currents. The moose's massive legs carried him through obstacles that would have been impassable for smaller creatures. His strength and size, which might have seemed like a liability in the flooded terrain, became an asset. He could traverse terrain that would have killed the baby beaver within minutes. After what felt like hours to the exhausted young beaver, they reached a place that offered better shelter. It was a rocky outcropping with a natural cave formation. Not large, but large enough for both of them to fit inside and be protected from the worst of the elements. The moose examined the cave carefully, ensuring that it was safe, that there were no other creatures already occupying it. Satisfied, he lay down inside the cave, his massive body filling much of the space. The baby beaver immediately curled up against his side, seeking the warmth and comfort that the moose provided. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cave, there was shelter, there was warmth, There was safety. And there was something else. Something that neither the moose nor the baby beaver fully understood, but both felt deeply. There was connection. There was a bond that had formed in the moment when the moose had entered the flood to save the young creature. A bond that transcended species, that ignored the normal rules of nature, that spoke to something fundamental and beautiful in the universe. The moose rested his massive head on the ground, his eyes watching over the small beaver that slept curled against his side. The young creature's breathing was steady now, no longer the ragged gasping of near drowning, but the peaceful breathing of a creature finding safety in the presence of another. The moose did not sleep. He remained vigilant, remained alert, remained ready to protect the small creature that had become, in the span of a few hours, the center of his world. Outside, the flood raged on, but inside the cave, there was peace. And in that peace, something remarkable was growing, a friendship that would change both of their lives, that would prove that compassion and connection could transcend every boundary that nature had created. The baby beaver did not know that his family was searching for him. He did not know that his mother was calling out his name into the chaos, that his father was diving into the receding floodwaters looking for any sign of him, that his entire colony was grieving what they believed was his death. But the baby beaver was alive, and he was no longer alone. In the cave, sheltered from the storm, the moose and the beaver rested together. And in that moment, an unlikely friendship was being born, a friendship that would become the subject of stories told for generations, a friendship that would prove that the bonds of compassion and care could overcome any obstacle that nature could create. 3 miles downstream, in what had once been the heart of the beaver colony, the baby beaver's father stood on the highest point of the remaining lodge, his massive frame silhouetted against the gray sky. The storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by devastation. The water was receding now, but slowly, revealing the extent of the catastrophe that had unfolded. The dam was gone, completely destroyed. What had taken generations to build had been obliterated in minutes. The lodge itself had survived, but barely. The upper chambers were intact, but the lower levels were flooded, filled with mud and debris. The colony's entire food cache, the carefully gathered branches and bark they had spent months preparing for winter, had been swept away by the flood. But none of that mattered to the baby beaver's father. What mattered was that his youngest son was missing. The father beaver had counted his family members obsessively since they had reached safety on the rocks. Over and over, he had gone through the list. His mate, his older offspring, his younger children. Every count came up one short. Every accounting revealed the same terrible truth. The baby beaver was gone. His mate was devastated. She had moved to the upper chamber of the lodge and refused to come out. The other family members had tried to comfort her, but there was no comfort to be found. A mother knows when she has lost a child. A mother can feel the absence like a physical wound. The baby beaver's grandmother sat in silence, her ancient eyes reflecting the wisdom that comes from living through many seasons. She had lost offspring before. It was the way of nature. But that knowledge did not ease the pain. It only made it deeper, more profound, more connected to the endless cycle of loss and grief that defined existence in the wild. The father beaver's older son, the baby beaver's brother, wanted to search. He wanted to swim downstream, to look for any sign of his younger sibling, to refuse to accept that the baby beaver was gone. But the father beaver had stopped him, understanding with the clarity that comes from experience that the search would be futile. The floodwaters had carried the young beaver far away, to places unknown. Even if the older brother found him, it would likely be too late. But the father beaver could not simply accept the loss. He could not simply move on to the business of rebuilding the colony as if nothing had happened. So he stood on the highest point of the lodge and looked out at the transformed landscape, his eyes searching the distant water for any sign of movement, any indication that his youngest son had somehow survived. The colony was in chaos. The flood had destroyed their home, their food stores, their entire way of life. Rebuilding would take months, perhaps years. Many of the younger beavers were injured, traumatized by the experience. Several older members of the colony had not survived the initial surge of water. The family that had seemed so strong, so permanent, so secure just days before, had been shattered. The father beaver understood what needed to be done. He understood that he needed to organize the colony, to direct the rebuilding efforts, to ensure that they had shelter and food before the winter arrived. He understood that his leadership was needed now more than ever. But he could not move. He could not turn away from his search. He could not accept that his youngest son was gone. Hours passed. The sun moved across the sky, and the water continued to recede. The father beaver remained on the lodge, watching, waiting, hoping for something that seemed increasingly impossible. It was his mate who finally came to him. She had emerged from the upper chamber, her eyes red from crying, her body moving with the weight of grief. She came to stand beside her mate on the highest point of the lodge, and together they looked out at the landscape that had once been their home. "He's gone," she said without words. Her body language conveyed what her voice could not express. The acceptance of loss, the acknowledgement of reality, the terrible understanding that their youngest son was not coming back. The father beaver wanted to deny it. He wanted to refuse to accept this truth. But he was a leader, and leaders had to face reality, however painful it might be. He had to accept that his son was gone, and he had to move forward for the sake of the colony that remained. He turned away from the water and looked at his mate. In her eyes, he saw his own grief reflected back at him. They had created this child together. They had watched him grow, had taught him the ways of the colony, had prepared him for a life they had believed would be long and full. And now that life had been taken away in an instant by forces beyond their control. The father beaver made a sound, a low, mournful call that echoed across the damaged landscape. It was a sound of grief, of loss, of the terrible understanding that some things, once lost, could never be recovered. The other members of the colony heard that sound, and they understood what it meant. The baby beaver was not coming back. The family's grief was acknowledged. The time had come to move forward. But even as the colony began the slow process of accepting their loss and planning their recovery, something was happening far upstream, in a cave sheltered from the storm that would change everything. Meanwhile, in the cave, the baby beaver was beginning to awaken to his new reality. The young creature's eyes opened slowly, his consciousness returning gradually from the depths of exhausted sleep. For a moment, he did not remember what had happened. He did not understand where he was or why everything felt so different. His small brain struggled to process the transformation that had occurred. Then memory returned, crashing over him like a wave. The storm, the flood, the terrible sensation of being torn away from his mother, the chaos of the water, the fear, the overwhelming terror of being alone in the darkness. The baby beaver made a small sound, a cry of distress that was barely audible. He tried to move, to swim away from this unfamiliar place, to find his way back home. But his body was too weak. The ordeal he had survived had drained him of strength. His muscles trembled as he tried to move. The moose's eyes opened. The massive creature had been resting, but not sleeping, maintaining the vigilance that had kept him alive through countless seasons. He watched as the young beaver struggled, as the small creature tried to understand what had happened to him. The moose did not try to stop the baby beaver's movements. Instead, he simply remained still, allowing the young creature to explore, to understand that this massive being meant no harm. The moose's eyes were gentle, his presence calm and reassuring. The baby beaver's struggles gradually subsided as exhaustion overtook him once again. The young creature's body collapsed against the moose's side, his small chest heaving with effort. He did not understand what had happened. He did not understand where his family had gone. He only knew that he was alive, that this massive creature was keeping him alive, and that the world had become a place of confusion and terror. The moose lowered his massive head, bringing his face close to the baby beaver. The young creature looked up at the huge creature that had saved him, and for a moment, something passed between them. A recognition, a connection, a bond that transcended the normal boundaries of nature. The moose made a low, rumbling sound, not threatening, but comforting. It was a sound that seemed to say, "You are safe. You are not alone. I will protect you." The baby beaver did not understand the words. Moose did not have words in the human sense, but he understood the meaning. He understood that this creature, despite being so different from him, despite being so much larger and more powerful, had chosen to care about his survival. The young beaver made a small, tentative sound in response, a sound that expressed both fear and gratitude, confusion and acceptance. Outside the cave, the world continued to transform. The water was receding, revealing the landscape that the flood had reshaped. The storm had moved on, leaving behind clear skies and the beginning of recovery. But inside the cave, the moose and the baby beaver remained, bound together by an act of compassion that would echo through the seasons to come. The moose knew that the young beaver would need food. He knew that the small creature could not survive on the plants that the moose ate. He would need to help the baby beaver find the resources it needed to survive. Bark, tender shoots, the specific foods that beavers required. But first, the young creature needed to rest. The baby beaver needed to recover from the ordeal it had survived. And the moose, in his own way, needed to understand what had happened to him. How a 1,000-pound creature had come to care so deeply about a tiny beaver that it would risk its own life to save it. As night fell, the moose settled down more fully, allowing his massive body to relax into sleep. The baby beaver curled up against his side, finding comfort in the warmth and the steady rhythm of the moose's breathing. And in that cave, sheltered from the world, an unlikely friendship deepened. A bond was forming that would challenge everything both creatures understood about the boundaries of nature, about the limits of compassion, about what was possible when one being chose to care for another. Back at the colony, the father beaver was organizing the survivors. The work of rebuilding had begun. But even as he directed the efforts, even as he made decisions about where to establish a temporary shelter and how to find food for the winter, a part of him remained on that bank, searching the water for any sign of his youngest son. He did not know that his son was alive. He did not know that the baby beaver was being cared for by a creature from a completely different world. He did not know that his child was safe, warm, and being given a second chance at life. But somewhere in the forest, a moose and a baby beaver were learning to live together. And in doing so, they were creating a story that would be told for generations. A story of compassion, of connection, of the incredible bonds that could form between creatures when one chose to care for another.